The morning after Christmas, my dad asked to talk, and what he told me made me question every memory I have. The morning after Christmas has always been quiet in our house, but that particular one felt different from the moment I opened my eyes. The air had a strange stillness to it, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something none of us were ready for. Even the light coming through my curtains felt muted, as if the sun itself didn't want to intrude on what the day was about to become. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, feeling a heaviness I couldn't explain. It wasn't the usual post-holiday fatigue or the emotional come-down after presents and family and too many late-night conversations. This felt deeper, heavier, like a weight pressing on my chest. Something in me knew, before I even got out of bed, that the world was about to shift in a way I couldn't undo. When I finally pushed myself up, the floorboards under my feet felt colder than usual. The hallway was silent, the kind of silence I remembered from childhood nights when my parents argued downstairs and tried to hide it. As I walked toward the kitchen, I caught a faint smell of coffee, but it was sharp and bitter, left out too long, untouched. My dad was sitting at the kitchen table, still dressed in the same flannel shirt he'd worn the night before. At first, I thought he was just tired, maybe drained from hosting family or staying up too late watching old movies. But then I saw his hands. They weren't just still, they were trembling, tiny tremors he wasn't even trying to hide. His coffee mug sat full beside him, steam long gone, as if he'd poured it only to hold on to something familiar. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just stared at the table, fingers curled tightly around the edge, knuckles pale. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the background, the only sound between us, and even that felt too loud for the tension sitting in the room. "Morning," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. My voice sounded strange, like it didn't belong to me. He nodded once, but didn't speak. The air between us thickened, heavy with something unspoken. I could feel it pressing into my skin, making every breath slow and careful. I moved to the counter and pretended to busy myself with the coffee maker, though I didn't really want any. I just needed something to do with my hands. My dad finally looked up, and the moment our eyes met, my stomach tightened. His expression wasn't the usual tired or stressed. It was something rawer, fear, regret, maybe both. "You sleep okay?" he asked, but the question sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced saying it just to avoid the thing he really wanted to say. I told him I slept fine, though we both knew I was lying. There was a pause, long enough to make me wonder if I should sit down or leave the room altogether. Instead, he took a shaky breath and said, "We need to talk." His voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something almost fragile, like the words themselves might break him open. I turned toward him fully then, my heart pushing hard against my ribs. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He rubbed his palms together slowly, like he was trying to warm them, even though the room wasn't cold. For a moment, he didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, jaw tightening, shoulders rising and falling with uneven breaths. "I should have told you a long time ago," he finally said. His eyes drifted toward the window, avoiding mine again. The morning light traced the edges of his profile, catching the gray hair near his temples, making him look older than he had the day before. I could almost see the thoughts fighting behind his eyes, pushing and pulling, searching for a way out. A faint memory flickered then, something small and unfinished, brushing the edge of my mind like a whisper I couldn't catch or fully understand in that quiet moment. When he finally looked at me again, something inside me tightened. His eyes were glossy, not from tears exactly, but from something heavier, regret, maybe. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, exhaling slowly. I could tell he was choosing his words carefully, weighing each one before letting it out. "You deserve to know the truth," he said, each word slow and deliberate. The tone in his voice wasn't one I recognized. It carried years of something, fear, secrets, maybe guilt. I felt a chill run down my spine, subtle but undeniable. "Okay," I said quietly, though my throat felt dry. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him, trying to steady my breathing. The table between us suddenly felt like a barrier, something that kept me from understanding what was happening. My dad looked down at his hands again, then at me, and the weight of whatever he was about to say filled the room. In that moment, with the cold coffee, the trembling hands, and the strange stillness hanging in the air, I realized the morning after Christmas would stay with me forever. Not because of what happened the day before, but because of what he was finally ready to say. The moment stretched between us like a thin, fragile thread, trembling and ready to snap. I could feel it in my chest, that tight, almost suffocating pressure that made every breath deliberate. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that magnifies every small creak or hum. I could hear the faint tick of the wall clock, steady and unrelenting, marking each second I dreaded. My dad sat across from me at the table, hands folded in front of him, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder. I could see the tension in his shoulders, rigid, as if bracing for something neither of us could yet name. I tried to find something familiar in his face, something to hold on to, but his features were tense in a way I'd never noticed before. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting slightly when I moved. Every small gesture seemed amplified in the quiet room. I wanted to speak, to say anything to fill the silence, but my voice felt lodged somewhere deep, and when I finally whispered, "Are you okay?" it sounded small, fragile, almost foreign. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, letting a sound escape that was equal parts resignation and fear. There was a moment when I thought I might retreat, walk away, let him have whatever he was holding back. But some force inside me rooted me to the spot, a mix of curiosity and dread that twisted into a tight knot in my stomach. I watched the way he kept glancing at the edge of the table, fingernails tapping lightly against the wood. Each tap seemed deliberate, a metronome counting out the seconds until he said the words I knew were coming. The heaviness in the room felt almost physical, pressing down on my shoulders, making it hard to move, to breathe normally. Then he spoke, and even before the words came, I sensed the weight behind them. "I need to tell you something," he said, voice low and deliberate, measured as though he'd rehearsed it for years. The sound of his own voice seemed to startle him slightly, and he rubbed his palms together like he was trying to warm himself or gather courage. I swallowed, my throat dry, heart thumping audibly in my ears. My mind raced through everything I thought I knew, trying to prepare for something I couldn't yet imagine. The air felt thick, almost sticky, as if the truth itself had settled over us like fog. I nodded, barely trusting myself to speak, letting him continue. He paused, hands tightening in a fist briefly, then relaxing again, a small shiver running down his spine. "The life you remember," he began, "isn't the full story." His words were soft, careful, as if speaking too loudly might shatter everything. I blinked, trying to process, the room suddenly feeling colder, more alien. My stomach lurched, twisting uneasily. The notion that everything I had trusted, every holiday, every ordinary moment, might have been altered, hidden, or protected in some way, filled me with a strange mixture of fear and disbelief. I tried to meet his eyes, to find some hint of what he meant, but he kept looking away, tracing a pattern on the table with his finger, hesitant, unsure. My own hands trembled slightly as I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. The familiar smells of coffee and toast seemed distant now, overlaid by the metallic taste of anxiety in my mouth. I could almost hear my heart in the background, thumping so loudly that I feared he could hear it, marking the rhythm of tension in the room. My mind started spinning, memories rising and falling like waves. The faces of family dinners, holidays, quiet evenings, all suddenly seemed fragmented. Something didn't fit, and the gaps between those moments were suddenly glaring. Empty spaces filled with questions I'd never dared to ask. The very foundation of what I had known felt unstable, and a creeping realization settled over me. The story my life had followed might not have been entirely mine to understand. I was looking at him, trying to read his expression, but it was guarded, carefully managed, hiding both the fear and the guilt I now sensed radiating off him. He exhaled again, slower this time, and leaned back slightly, as if preparing himself for the next words, the ones that would stretch the line between me and him even thinner. "You need to listen carefully," he said. The words weren't sharp, not commanding, but there was an edge of urgency I couldn't ignore. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, subtle but insistent, as if the room itself was warning me. My lips parted, but no words came. I could only nod, letting my body affirm what my mind barely dared to process. It was the first moment I realized the conversation would not be simple, that it would unravel things I had never questioned before, and that the weight of it might stay with me far beyond this morning. The silence that followed was heavy but quieter now, different than before. It carried anticipation rather than threat, and I could feel a tiny shift between us, a fragile connection that hung on the promise of understanding. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my racing thoughts, letting my eyes soften as I focused on the steady rhythm of his breathing. There was fear in him, yes, but also something else, an acknowledgement that the truth was finally coming to light, however imperfectly, and that I, too, was now part of it, that I've spent a lot of time thinking about my childhood, and for the longest time, I believed it was perfect. The kind of life people put in holiday cards, smiling faces, neatly wrapped presents under the tree, laughter filling the rooms. But now, looking back with everything I've learned, I see the cracks hiding beneath the surface, subtle and almost invisible at the time. It wasn't that my parents were cruel, not exactly, but there was always an undercurrent of control, a careful choreography that made every moment seem just right, just safe, just managed. Even the way my father smiled at me sometimes felt rehearsed, as if he knew what the image should look like, not necessarily what he felt. I remember mornings when the sunlight would spill across the living room, catching the ornaments on the tree just so. I would run down the stairs, heart racing with excitement, expecting hugs and cheerful greetings. But instead of the warmth I expected, there was a tension, a subtle pause, as if someone was testing to see how I'd react. My father would be there, coffee in hand, perfectly calm on the surface, but there was always something in his eyes, a flicker that I couldn't understand at the time. Looking back now, I see it as a signal, a warning I didn't notice, a sign that beneath the neat lines of our family life, something was being held back. There were other signs, too, small and easy to ignore. Conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room, voices dropping to whispers that left me straining to hear. Rules that seemed oddly rigid for no reason I could articulate, like certain questions were forbidden before I even knew the answers. My father would sometimes watch me too closely, not with suspicion exactly, but with an intensity that felt uncomfortable in a way I couldn't name. I chalked it up to him being protective, to the kind of love parents have for their children, but in hindsight, it was more than that. It was a careful orchestration of what I could and couldn't know, a quiet shaping of the narrative of my own life. Even holidays, which should have been carefree, were structured and precise. My father insisted on certain traditions, not for enjoyment, but for control. The way we opened presents, the timing of the meals, even the positions where we sat at the table. Everything had a rhythm that could not be broken. I never questioned it then. To me, it was normal, comforting even. But now I see it as evidence of the meticulousness with which he constructed my world, a world that looked happy but left little room for unpredictability or genuine spontaneity. It was as if every smile was placed, every laugh timed, and every gesture monitored. I remember one evening, maybe when I was 7 or 8, sitting at the kitchen table and noticing my mother and father whispering in the corner. Their voices were low, urgent, and when I asked what they were talking about, my father's expression tightened, and he waved me away with a small, dismissive hand gesture. "It's nothing, don't worry about it," he said, but his eyes flicked to mine with something unspoken, a weight I couldn't lift at the time. That moment, insignificant then, now stands out as a key in the pattern of my upbringing. It was the first time I sensed that the world I believed in wasn't quite complete, that there were things deliberately kept from me. Even school memories carry this duality. I remember my father driving me to class, pointing out every neighborhood decoration, every smiling neighbor, his voice cheerful but somehow strained. I never understood why he never joined the conversations when my friends came over, why he seemed to retreat into shadows whenever our lives intersected with others outside our carefully maintained bubble. Looking back, I realized that his presence was always strategic, a balance between being involved and remaining unseen in ways that shaped my interactions, my understanding of normal, and ultimately, my perception of safety. There was comfort in the predictability, yes, but it was a comfort built on a hidden scaffolding of rules and omissions. I didn't see the cracks then. I only felt the warmth and security of family, unaware that every smile and every laugh might have been part of a performance meant to maintain an image rather than convey truth. It's strange to realize that what I thought was love was also, in subtle ways, a mechanism of control, carefully administered under the guise of care. And yet, even now, I can't entirely separate the genuine affection from the choreography. It all blends together in my memory, a mixture of fondness and unease. By the time I reached double digits in age, the pattern had become ingrained in me. I adapted to it without knowing, learning the unspoken rules of when to speak, when to laugh, when to look surprised or delighted. Every interaction with my parents carried a silent weight, one I only recognize now, that shaped the way I understood relationships and trust. That realization leaves me with a bittersweet ache, a recognition that my childhood, while outwardly perfect, was meticulously constructed, and that every small pleasure was built atop a foundation of hidden tension, orchestrated smiles, and carefully withheld truths that I can still remember the first time I sensed that something about my childhood wasn't as simple as I thought. I must have been no older than 6, maybe 7, and the house had that quiet hum that always comes just after dinner. I wandered into the living room, expecting the usual scene, my parents talking softly, the hum of the TV in the background. But instead, I caught snippets of their voices, urgent and low, drifting from the kitchen. My dad's voice was sharper than I'd ever heard. My mother's more strained, almost fearful. I froze, unsure if I should walk closer or retreat. There was a phrase that cut through the murmur. "We have to keep this quiet." My stomach sank, but I didn't understand what it meant. I only knew that something serious was being discussed without me. Back then, I shrugged it off. I figured all parents argued, that whispers and sudden silences were just part of being grown up. Kids aren't supposed to understand adult matters, I told myself, and I went back to my toys, trying to push the unease away. But the memory of their tones stayed with me in fragments. The taut edge in his words, the tremor in her hands, the weight of something unsaid. It was the first crack, subtle yet undeniable, in the foundation of what I thought was a perfectly normal childhood. Looking back now, I can see it as a warning that I ignored because I trusted them, because I believed that my parents' love was all that mattered and that anything else could be dismissed as adult complications. Over the years, I noticed other moments that didn't fit the picture I had of my family. I remember asking innocent questions about where certain toys came from or why relatives I didn't know seemed absent from our lives. And my father would suddenly shift, his calm faltering for just a moment before he smiled and redirected the conversation. That slight pause, barely perceptible at the time, now reads like a signal, a door closing in front of me, leaving me in the dark. I can see now that he wasn't avoiding questions out of whimsy. He was protecting secrets I wasn't meant to understand yet. And in that protection, I can't help but feel the first stirrings of betrayal. The way he would sometimes react with sudden panic when I stumbled upon something small and seemingly insignificant is etched in my memory. I recall a day when I found an envelope tucked behind a stack of papers on his desk. Curiosity overtook me, and I asked what it was. He froze, a sharp inhale escaping him, eyes wide for a second, and then he forced a casual smile. Nothing important, he said, but his trembling hands gave him away, and in that moment, I realized that nothing important might be the exact opposite. Those little slips, unnoticed or explained away at the time, were pieces of a puzzle I wouldn't understand for years. They were signals of a life carefully managed, truths held just out of reach. Even ordinary conversations sometimes felt rehearsed. My parents would ask questions I had answered 100 times before in the same tone, the same cadence, as though practicing an act that required perfection. And when they glanced at each other, there was a fleeting exchange, a glance of concern, a quick nod that I couldn't interpret then. Looking back, it seems obvious. They were coordinating, silently managing how I perceived the world. At the time, it seemed normal, even comforting. Now, it feels like a manipulation I didn't recognize until much later, a methodical construction of an environment that looked secure but was threaded with control. I think about the nights when I would overhear muffled voices through the walls, arguments that always ended abruptly when footsteps approached. I didn't understand the content, only the tone, the sharp bursts, the quick corrections, the tense sighs. As a child, I believed that this was just normal adult tension, that it would resolve itself. But now I know those moments were signals I wasn't meant to ignore, a life governed by careful omissions, a story curated so that I would see only what they wanted me to see. The more I revisit these memories, the more I notice how patterns emerge, how early cracks reveal themselves as truths long hidden. By the time I reached my preteen years, the unease had subtly embedded itself in my understanding of trust. I could feel it in small ways. The way my father's smile never fully reached his eyes when discussing relatives, the hesitation in my mother's voice when I asked about old friends, the sudden hush that would fall if I lingered too long in a room where they were speaking privately. Those were the moments that slowly eroded the unshakable belief I had in a perfectly transparent, loving household. It wasn't that I knew the full truth, far from it, but the signals were there, persistent and unyielding, showing me that my parents' behavior had patterns I couldn't yet decipher. I didn't realize it at the time, but the trajectory had already been set. My memories were not purely mine, shaped only by my experiences. They were curated, edited, and sometimes suppressed. And it's only now, revisiting those first subtle cracks, the whispered arguments, the panicked glances, the nothing important moments, that I begin to see the extent to which my world was orchestrated. That realization is heavy, more than I can articulate, but it also brings clarity. The cracks were always there, waiting for me to notice them, waiting for the day when I could finally see that my parents' behavior started long before I was old enough to understand that I started noticing it when I was still young. How Christmas seemed different in our house compared to everyone else's. Other families laughed, exchanged gifts with unrestrained joy, and took pictures without thinking twice. In our house, every holiday carried a tension I didn't understand at the time. My father would pace, sometimes rubbing his hands together or staring at the ceiling as if trying to memorize some invisible checklist. There was always a tightness in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. I remember feeling a little guilty for my excitement, as though my enthusiasm might push him over some invisible edge. Birthday mornings weren't much better. I would wake up expecting balloons, wrapping paper, and the smell of pancakes, but instead, I would find him sitting silently at the table, staring at his coffee like it could give him answers. He would force a smile when I approached, but it never reached his eyes. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe he just wasn't a celebration person. But deep down, even then, I could feel that something else was at play, something that made the most ordinary of days feel fragile and heavy. I recall the annual ritual of taking holiday photos. What should have been simple joy became a study in control. My dad would position us with a precision that seemed almost obsessive, adjusting collars, straightening ties, and rearranging hair until everything looked perfect. When I glanced at his face in the mirror afterward, I could see his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the room, alert to every tiny imperfection. On some level, I thought he was just being thorough, making sure we looked good. But now I recognize the fear underneath it, the anxiety that this image, the facade, had to be flawless or something unknown would happen. Phone calls were another test of endurance. Certain relatives never came up in conversation, and whenever they did, his hand would tremble slightly as he held the receiver. He would speak softly, almost in a whisper, careful with each word, as though saying too much could summon danger. I didn't understand why then, only that he seemed tense and wary, and I, a child, felt the weight of that vigilance pressing down on me. The holiday should have been mine, filled with excitement and warmth, but it was always shadowed by his unease. Even small traditions, like hanging ornaments on the tree or lighting the menorah at my best friend's house, brought on subtle but noticeable tension. He would participate mechanically, almost reluctantly, moving through the motions without ever really relaxing. I remember the sound of his sighs, long and quiet, and the way he avoided eye contact when I tried to include him in my holiday excitement. At the time, I thought maybe he just didn't like traditions, that it wasn't personal. Looking back now, I realize it wasn't that he disliked them. It was that something about holidays exposed vulnerabilities he wasn't ready to face. The emotional pattern became even more apparent during gift exchanges. He would hand me a present, his fingers trembling slightly around a wrapping paper, as if he was worried about revealing too much with a simple gift. The weight of expectation in his eyes was impossible to ignore. I can still remember the lingering pause before he smiled, the way he would glance at my mother for reassurance, and the subtle shift in his posture when he thought no one was watching. These moments weren't about generosity. They were about control, about ensuring that nothing could slip through the cracks. I began to notice the inconsistency in his reactions to people we saw only during the holidays. Neighbors, distant relatives, or old friends would appear, and his polite facade would sometimes fracture. A brief stiffening of his shoulders, a tightened jaw, or a fleeting frown would flash across his face before he composed himself again. As a child, I didn't know how to interpret it. It felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve, a signal that something important was being hidden, and that my father was always guarding more than just the gifts under the tree. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept in gradually, a slow awareness that the tension was never about normal stress or fatigue. It was fear, masked beneath forced smiles, careful words, and rehearsed gestures. Holidays became markers, not of joy, but of his unease. I could sense it in the air, smell it faintly, like the bitter tang of coffee left too long on the counter, and feel in my own chest a subtle tightness that mirrored his own. The more I revisited these memories, the clearer it became that the unease wasn't random. It was part of a long, unspoken pattern that had shaped my childhood. And then a specific memory surfaced, one that had always felt out of place. It was a Christmas when I was 9. I had received a small wooden toy, something delicate and handcrafted, and my father's hands had shaken as he handed it to me. But the look on his face wasn't excitement or happiness. It was fear, sharp and unmistakable. He glanced over his shoulder at my mother as though checking for an unseen presence. And I understood, in that moment, that something about our lives was not as simple as I'd been told. That unease threaded into every holiday, every birthday, every celebration was a secret waiting to be uncovered. There's a memory that has haunted me for as long as I can remember, though I never knew why it felt so out of place. I was probably 5 or 6, sitting on the living room carpet, when I saw a face I didn't recognize. It was soft-featured, gentle but urgent. The voice attached to it whispered sharply, almost in a warning, "It's not safe. Don't go." I didn't understand who this person was, and yet the fear they carried burrowed into my chest and stayed there. I remember gripping the edge of the couch, my knuckles whitening and feeling a shiver run up my spine that had nothing to do with cold. It was pure unease, inexplicable and piercing. For years, I dismissed it, thinking it was just a dream or some fragment of imagination. But as I revisited my childhood through the lens of my father's strange behaviors, I began to question everything. That face, that voice, it didn't fit anywhere in the story my parents told me about my early years. I couldn't place it among familiar relatives or family friends. The memory clashed violently with what I had been led to believe. I kept trying to force it into a logical frame, but every effort left a hollow pit in my stomach, a sense that something fundamental was missing. Even more troubling was the sense of urgency in that memory. The warning wasn't casual. It was loaded with fear and insistence, as though someone had been trying to protect me from an invisible danger. I remember the scent of something faintly floral, almost antiseptic, lingering in the room, and the soft rustle of fabric as the figure moved quickly out of sight. I hadn't been able to name the fear at the time, but now I recognize it as a signal of something hidden, something deliberately kept from me. The memory's intrusion was subtle, but it gnawed at me with a persistent insistence that I couldn't ignore. I began to see connections in hindsight, small, disjointed pieces of my early life that never made sense. Why did my father sometimes freeze in place when I asked about my earliest memories? Why did conversations abruptly halt when I entered certain rooms? Why did he seem to calculate his words, as though a single misplaced phrase could unravel the carefully constructed world around me? The memory that didn't belong started to cast shadows on everything else, and slowly, I realized that the calm, perfect household I remembered might have been just that, a carefully curated facade. The deeper I dug into these recollections, the more I questioned the stability of my past. One evening, I brought it up cautiously to my father, trying to gauge his reaction. "Do you remember a stranger warning me as a kid?" I asked, almost hesitating to speak the words aloud. His face tightened instantly, his eyes darting away before settling back on me with forced composure. He said nothing for a long moment, and I could feel the weight of his silence pressing down on me. That pause, that careful avoidance, was all the confirmation I needed that the memory had real roots. My father's reaction was a mixture of fear, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name. A trembling acknowledgement of a truth he hadn't been ready to share. The realization that my earliest years might have been edited or reshaped hit me in waves. I felt a disorienting mix of emotions. Confusion at the gaps in my history, fear that my world had been manipulated from the start, and an almost visceral determination to uncover the truth. Every familiar room, every photo, and every routine suddenly carried the possibility of secrets hidden beneath the surface. I remembered how my father always tried to control who I met, what I was told, and where I went. The memory of the stranger's warning illuminated the reason behind that control, hinting at a danger I had been shielded from, but at a cost I couldn't yet measure. The more I reflected, the more urgent the need for answers became. That single intrusive memory, once easily dismissed, had grown into a cornerstone of suspicion. I began to question whether the calm stability of my childhood had ever been genuine or if it was a carefully maintained illusion. Even the smallest incidents, a door left slightly ajar, a whispered conversation cut short, a warning glance exchanged between my parents, took on new meaning. The memory that didn't belong was no longer just a fragment. It was a clue, a puzzle piece that refused to be ignored. Finally, I confronted my father again, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. I needed to know about that memory, about the face and the voice that haunted me. His expression hardened slightly at first, but then the tension in his shoulders softened, a reluctant admission flickering in his eyes. I demanded he explain, not to judge or accuse, but because the uncertainty was unbearable. The fear and confusion that had lived in that shadowy corner of my mind for years needed illumination. And in that moment, I realized the fragile truth. The memory might be real, and the world my father had built around me was far more complicated than I could have imagined. I had expected answers when I approached him that evening, a quiet tension hanging between us like a storm about to break. The living room smelled faintly of pine from the Christmas tree, still standing with its lights twinkling softly in the dim corner. My hands were clammy, and I could feel my pulse in my temples as I tried to steady my voice. "I need to know," I said finally, looking at him directly. His eyes flickered, hesitant, like a candle wavering in the wind. He took a slow breath, and I sensed immediately that what he was about to say would not be simple. He began cautiously, his words deliberate, measured. "There are things from your past, things I've never shared," he said. His fingers drummed nervously against the arm of the chair. "I can't explain everything. Not yet. Not until you understand what's at stake. I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was a pleading edge in his voice, but also a hardness, a defensive quality that made me wary. I wanted clarity, but what I got was a tightrope, and I wasn't sure if he was leading me or holding me back. He confessed partially, just enough to ignite suspicion without offering the whole truth. I realized he was terrified, not of my reaction, but of what the truth itself would unleash. Each sentence he spoke revealed carefully guarded shadows of my childhood. Names I didn't recognize, situations vaguely described, warnings that never reached me. Someone was involved, he said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper. Someone dangerous. The words felt like ice sliding down my spine. My mind spun, trying to connect these fragments with memories I had long buried. Fear, confusion, and anger churned inside me simultaneously, an almost physical ache pressing against my chest. As he spoke, I noticed small tells that betrayed his composure. His hands shook slightly as he rested them on his knees, and he avoided my gaze at moments that seemed critical. A bead of sweat glistened at his temple, catching the dim light from the tree, and I knew these weren't just nervous tics. They were guilt and fear manifesting physically. I wanted to push him to demand the rest, but every instinct in me screamed caution. I realized I was navigating a minefield, and any misstep could close off the truth entirely. He revealed fragments of my early years that I couldn't reconcile with what I had always believed. There were half-explained events, encounters with strangers whose purpose was unclear, and choices he said he made to protect me. But protection felt like a thin veil over control. The more he skirted the full story, the more I pieced together what must have been real. He described moments when he had made decisions on my behalf without my knowledge, shielding me from people I might have known, experiences I might have had. I felt a mixture of gratitude and fury, grateful to have been protected, furious to have been kept in the dark. At one point, he faltered, his voice trembling just slightly, and he admitted the danger was more serious than I could understand. "It's not safe to know everything yet," he said, almost to himself. I could hear the tension in his throat, the way he swallowed hard to contain emotion he didn't want me to see. My stomach turned, a sour knot of frustration twisting inside me. The fear in his eyes mirrored my own, but it was layered with secrecy and something else, something I couldn't name but felt immediately. It was the sense that he had been balancing my life on a knife's edge and that any revelation now could tip it dangerously. I tried to anchor myself, searching his face for clarity. Every glance seemed to reveal more than he intended. Furtive admissions in a twitch of his mouth, a shift of his shoulders, a sigh that betrayed exhaustion and guilt. The room felt smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding in the tension. I realized that my father, who had always seemed unflappable, was carrying a weight that had shaped not just his actions, but mine as well. The careful structure of my childhood was fragile, built on decisions I hadn't been allowed to see. Then almost abruptly, he stopped talking. The conversation hung in the air, unfinished, as if he had reached the limit of what he could confess without losing control. The weight of the half-truth pressed on me, suffocating and maddening. I wanted to demand more, to unravel the entire story, but his expression, pained, tense, wary, made me hesitate. I understood now that I was facing a choice: push for answers and risk shutting him down entirely, or wait and gather the pieces myself. The frustration and betrayal I felt were sharp, cutting into the trust one had always taken for granted. By the end of the evening, he had retreated in his silence, leaving me with a gnawing uncertainty that refused to settle. I sat alone, the faint glow of the Christmas lights reflecting off the ornaments and casting shadows that seemed to mimic the gaps in my memory. Anger simmered quietly beneath the surface, intertwined with sorrow and confusion. I realized that this partial confession had done something profound. It had cracked open the foundation of my childhood, revealing the first glimpses of a truth I had never been prepared to confront. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I knew that nothing would ever feel the same again, that I couldn't stop thinking about what my dad had said, or more accurately, what he hadn't said. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with all the things left unsaid. When he went out for an errand that afternoon, I found myself wandering toward his study, my heart hammering with a mixture of dread and determination. Something was buried here, something he had kept from me for years, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The familiar creak of the wooden floorboards under my feet made each step feel louder than it should have been, echoing in the empty house like a warning. I hesitated outside his closet, hand hovering over the brass handle. It smelled faintly of cedar and old clothes, the sort of scent that normally brings comfort. But today it was different. Heavy, oppressive, like it was guarding secrets it had been carrying for decades. My fingers trembled as I turned the knob, half expecting some force to stop me. The door opened with a reluctant groan, and I peered inside. Rows of clothes hung neatly on hangers, as orderly as always, but my eyes were drawn to a large cardboard box shoved toward the back, hidden in the shadows behind coats and old suitcases. The box looked ordinary, but something about it screamed importance. I knelt in front of it, brushing away dust that had settled on the top, and felt a thrill of fear and anticipation coil in my stomach. The lid was taped shut with brown packing tape, frayed at the edges. I paused for a moment, thinking of my father, of the years of trust and blind faith I had placed in him, and then slowly pulled the tape away. The lid lifted with a soft creak, revealing contents that made my breath catch. Inside were documents, letters, and photographs that immediately contradicted everything I had ever been told. The papers were stacked neatly, almost ceremoniously, as if someone had been meticulous about hiding them, but still preserving them. I picked up the top envelope, my hands shaking. The handwriting was unfamiliar, precise, and official, not my father's. I unfolded it carefully, my eyes scanning lines that hinted at events and people I had no memory of, stories that didn't align with the childhood narrative I had always trusted. A cold knot of disbelief twisted in my stomach. Beneath the papers, I found photographs. I held one up to the light, squinting at a scene I didn't recognize. A baby in the arms of a woman whose face was both tender and urgent. A man whose expression was serious, but not the one I knew. It was me, or someone who looked exactly like me, but the context was alien. Other photos revealed different people, always holding me, always watching, always present in moments that my memory refused to acknowledge. The familiarity of my own face against these strange surroundings made my head spin. How could these have existed without me knowing? How could my father have kept this from me? I sifted through the rest of the contents, pulling out letters and documents that appeared to be legal in nature. Some were court papers with names I didn't recognize, dates that predated any memory I had of the house, and stamps that carried official weight. Others were letters addressed to me personally, never received, never explained. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, conveying messages of concern, hope, and longing. A wave of nausea hit me as I realized that someone had tried to reach me, had tried to be part of my life, and my father had prevented it. Every document, every photo, every letter told the same story. My childhood had been rewritten without my consent. I sank to the floor, letting the box rest on my lap. The weight of what I was discovering pressed down on me physically, making my legs tremble and my chest tighten. I couldn't reconcile the images and words in front of me with the life I thought I had known. Every carefully crafted memory, every story my parents had told, suddenly felt fragile, constructed, almost performative. The realization cut deeper than anger or sadness. It was a fundamental shift in understanding, a betrayal of the trust one had never questioned until now. For a long time, I simply sat there, breathing unevenly, letting the enormity of the discovery sink in. I could still hear the faint hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the clock, ordinary noises that now felt intrusive, reminding me of the life I had assumed was mine, unchanged. I ran my fingers over the edges of the photographs, the paper smooth and unyielding, holding decades of secrets. It was overwhelming to think that my father had carried this knowledge silently, carefully, for so long. The anger simmered quietly, but beneath it, an icy sense of clarity began to form. This was not a mistake. This was intentional. By the time he returned, the box was closed, taped shut once more, and shoved back into its shadowed corner. I stood, my knees stiff, heart still racing, trying to mask the storm inside. My father noticed nothing, or pretended to. The air between us carried a tension that was now mutual, unspoken but heavy. I had seen the proof of years of secrecy, and nothing would feel normal again. The realization settled quietly, a shadow in the back of my mind. My father had kept these items hidden for decades, guarding a story that was not entirely his to protect. And now, holding fragments of that story in my hands, I knew that my next steps would have to be deliberate, careful, and unflinching. I hadn't expected anyone from the past to reach out. After discovering the box in my dad's closet, I thought I was alone in this, sifting through years of secrets, trying to piece together a life that had been rewritten. But one late evening, my phone buzzed with a notification from an old, long-forgotten email account. I hadn't touched it in years, and yet here it was, a message flagged as urgent. The sender was unfamiliar, but the subject line made my stomach drop. You need to know the truth before it's too late. I stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure if I should open it. My room felt suddenly smaller, the shadows cast by the dim lamps stretching across the walls like fingers reaching for me. The silence was punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs, but it felt amplified, a reminder of how alone I had been in this house. Finally, with a shaky breath, I clicked. The message itself was brief, almost cryptic. It spoke of someone who had known me as a child, someone who had tried to be part of my life, and some of my parents had deliberately kept away. My pulse quickened, a mix of fear and hope coiling tight in my chest. The words on the screen forced me to sit back in my chair. Each sentence carried a weight that made my head spin. There was no time for niceties, no explanation of motives, just a stark warning. The life I thought I had lived was not complete. They hinted that my father's secrets went beyond family arguments or hidden boxes. There were people, institutions, maybe even legal maneuvers that had shaped my early years without my knowledge. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the images in the box with this new layer of reality. Someone else had been watching, someone else had tried to intervene, and now they were reaching out to me directly. I reread the message, slowly this time, trying to absorb every word. The sender didn't identify themselves fully. They were careful, cautious, but there was a sense of urgency that couldn't be ignored. They mentioned details that matched the documents I'd found. Names, dates, even the woman and man in some of the photographs. The connection was undeniable. My chest tightened as I realized that these fragments were part of a much larger puzzle. Someone knew the truth, and they were trying to give me a chance to uncover it before it was too late. Paranoia crept in, subtle but insistent. If they knew, who else did? Was my father aware that someone had reached out? The idea that I might be under watch, even in my own home, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I looked around the room, at the familiar walls and shelves, and suddenly everything seemed foreign, as though the house itself was a trap of memories and lies. I felt exposed, like peeling back the top layer of a painting only to find a hidden canvas underneath, one that told a story entirely different from the one I had always believed. I tried to piece together what this person wanted from me. There was no request for money, no demand for confrontation, just an insistence that I see the truth, that I acknowledge what had been hidden. I could feel their fear, their urgency, in every carefully chosen word. They were reaching across years of silence, trying to hand me the fragments of a past I had been denied. And I knew, instinctively, that I couldn't ignore it. The moment demanded action, even if I didn't fully understand what I was stepping into. The next hours were a blur of research and cross-referencing. I pulled out the documents and photographs from the hidden box again, laying them across my desk in a chaotic mosaic of truth. Each piece matched hints in the message. familiar yet alien, comforting in a way that made my heart ache and terrifying in its implications. Every signature, every note, seemed to pulse with intention, a silent proof that my father had actively reshaped my life. And now, someone else was offering me the chance to reclaim what had been lost. By the time I put the phone down, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but I couldn't shake the tension that gripped me. I felt a strange combination of paranoia and purpose, a sense that the world had suddenly expanded beyond the walls of my childhood home. The message had shifted everything. I realized that I was no longer the passive observer of my own story. I was being called to act, to chase down the truth before it slipped further out of reach. The following days were spent preparing, cautiously and deliberately. I saved the message, made notes, and considered every possible outcome. The sender had requested a meeting, a safe place to talk, and I knew I had to take it seriously. My sense of urgency was mingled with fear. Fear of what I might discover, fear of who I might meet, and fear that my father's carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Yet beneath it all was a spark of determination, a resolve that I wouldn't let decades of secrecy dictate the rest of my life. By the end of that week, I had a plan. I would meet this person, I would listen, and I would piece together the fragments of my stolen past. The shadows of paranoia lingered, but so did a quiet hope, the kind that comes when someone offers you a chance to finally know the truth. I felt the weight of years of lies pressing down, but also the first flicker of control. Someone from my past had reached out, and for the first time, I felt like I might finally start reclaiming the story that was always mine, that I arrived at the small cafe, just before noon, the kind of place with soft jazz playing faintly in the background and sunlight pooling in warm patches across the wooden floor. I scanned the tables, heart hammering in my chest. My phone buzzed in my pocket again, a reminder of the message that had led me here. I wasn't sure what I expected. A friend, a stranger, someone who might confirm my worst fears or offer solace. But nothing could have prepared me for the woman who finally appeared. She was older, maybe, in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back loosely and sharp eyes that flicked around the room nervously. When she saw me, she hesitated, then approached slowly, her movements cautious, almost deliberate. There was a tremor in her hands that I noticed immediately, and the faint smell of lavender clung to her coat. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she paused a few feet from me, as though measuring whether it was safe to engage. Her gaze, heavy with something I couldn't yet name, made me feel like a child again, waiting for someone to tell me the truth. Finally, she sat, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "You probably have a lot of questions," she said quietly, her voice betraying tension despite the calm she tried to project. "And I can't answer all of them. Not here. Not yet." The pause stretched, filled only by the clinking of dishes and the murmur of other patrons. I nodded, unsure what to say. There was a weight in the air, the kind of heaviness that settles before a storm, and I realized immediately that whatever she was about to tell me would change everything. She took a slow breath, glancing around as if the walls themselves might listen. "I knew your father a long time ago," she began, her words deliberate. "Before you were born, even. I tried to be part of your life, but he wouldn't allow it. I don't know how much he told you, but there are things that he kept hidden. Things you need to know." Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the kind of urgency that made my stomach tighten. I tried to keep my face neutral, but inside, a storm of anticipation and dread churned. I leaned in slightly, my palms resting on the table, trying to read her expression. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but also determination. She had made a choice to come here, to speak, despite the obvious risk. I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and anxiety. Every instinct told me this encounter could unravel the fabric of my life, or finally stitch together the fragments that had been torn apart. "Who are you?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you reach out now?" Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her coat as she answered. "I've watched for years, hoping you'd find the truth for yourself. But now, you've started asking questions, and I can't stay silent anymore. Your father, He kept you from people who cared about you. I don't know why he thought he could protect you by lying, but he did. And it's time you know. Her words cut through me, each one landing with a force I hadn't anticipated. My chest tightened, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. The gravity of her admission pressed on me, making the room feel smaller, the air heavier. I wanted to ask everything at once, to demand every detail, every hidden truth, but she held up a hand. Not yet. Not here. You have to understand, there are legal things involved, and I could get into trouble if I reveal too much in public. But I have something for you. Something that will explain more than I ever could in words right now. She reached in her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope, its edges worn, the paper yellowed with age. I could see the weight of history in her careful grip, the way she hesitated before setting it in front of me on the table. I picked it up gingerly, feeling the texture of the envelope, the subtle rigidity that spoke of documents carefully preserved. My hands trembled slightly, whether from fear or anticipation, I couldn't tell. The cafe noise faded around me, the sunlight pooling differently, as if the world had shifted. She leaned back, eyes still locked on mine. "Read it alone," she said, her voice steady now, but still carrying the urgency that had brought her here. "Everything you need to understand, everything your father didn't want you to know, is inside. But you must be prepared. Once you see it, there's no turning back." I nodded, swallowing hard, the weight of her words anchoring me in place. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in my hands, a tangible symbol of decades of secrecy, lies, and lost years. I sensed that this meeting, this single act of courage on her part, was the hinge on which my understanding of my life would swing. I could feel the tension in my chest, a mix of fear, anger, and anticipation, as I imagined what awaited me within those folded papers. The realization that someone from my past had fought to reach me, despite the barriers my father had erected, filled me with a strange combination of sorrow and hope. When she finally stood to leave, she gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the role I now had to play. She walked away slowly, her coat brushing against the chair, as if she were leaving a piece of herself behind. I remained seated, staring at the envelope, the quiet hum of the cafe returning around me. But I felt disconnected from it. The air felt charged, alive with the promise of revelation. And in that charged silence, I knew my life was about to change forever. I sat alone in my room, the envelope from the woman still clutched in my hands. Its weight felt heavier than the papers inside, as if decades of secrecy pressed down on me through the thin paper. I hesitated before opening it, the tip of my thumb tracing the worn edges, feeling the faint creases where it had been sealed so carefully. My heart thumped in my chest, a mix of fear and anticipation. I knew this was the moment that could change everything, could unravel the life I thought I knew. With a trembling hand, I broke the seal and pulled out the contents. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Aged paper, faintly musty, carrying the scent of time and hidden truths. There were several documents, neatly stacked, along with folded letters that seemed to have been preserved with care. My eyes went immediately to the official papers, court filings, legal notices, and custody forms that I had never seen before. The realization hit me immediately. My father was not my legal guardian at one point. My stomach twisted, nausea rising like a wave I couldn't stop. I unfolded one of the letters, my hands shaking as I read the elegant handwriting addressed to me. It was from someone who had clearly tried to be in my life, a woman who called me by name, who spoke of memories and moments I could not recall. She had written about her attempts to contact my father, her hopes to see me, and her confusion and heartbreak when her letters never reached me. Every line was a reminder that I had been deliberately kept from someone who cared. My eyes blurred with tears, a mix of betrayal and grief that I hadn't allowed myself to feel until this moment. The documents confirmed it. Visitation attempts that had been filed and ignored, legal notices my father had withheld, and letters he had intercepted. It wasn't just an oversight or a minor concealment. It was deliberate. My chest tightened with a mixture of rage and sorrow. I realized how much of my childhood, my sense of family, had been constructed around lies. Every memory of my father's overprotectiveness, every sudden change in plans, every refusal to meet certain people, it all made sense now. He had built a wall around me, and I hadn't known why. I traced my finger over the stamped court dates, the official seals, and the signatures, each one a cold, undeniable testament to the truth. It was surreal, reading words that meant I had been deliberately isolated. A part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers, to confront him immediately, but another part of me felt numb, almost detached, as if the weight of this betrayal had hollowed out my chest. I couldn't reconcile the father I loved with the man who had done this, and the gap between those two versions of him felt impossibly vast. I moved on to the photographs tucked inside the envelope. There were pictures of me as a baby and toddler, held in the arms of people I had no memory of. The images were tender, intimate, full of care and love, and yet they were proof of a life my father had hidden. Seeing those faces so familiar in their affection, but foreign to me, I felt a pang of loss that went deeper than anything I had ever known. They represented what I could have had, would have been taken from me without explanation. I read through every letter, every document, letting the information sink in. Each piece added to a mounting sense of betrayal. My father had been acting not only as a protector, but as a gatekeeper, choosing who could enter my life and who couldn't. And for years, I had trusted him completely, never imagining he could orchestrate such a deception. The betrayal was layered. It wasn't just the lies, but the years of memories built around those lies. Holidays, birthdays, family gatherings, they all carried an invisible shadow now, a hidden manipulation I hadn't seen. As I sat there, surrounded by evidence of my father's secrecy, I realized something else. This envelope was more than a revelation. It was a key. It gave me clarity, a map of what had been hidden and how to navigate it. I understood now that I had agency in this, that I could confront the past, confront my father, and demand the truth that had been withheld for so long. My grief was raw, but alongside it, a quiet determination began to form. By the time I put the letters and documents back in the envelope, I felt a strange mixture of heartbreak and resolve. I had known something was off, a lingering tension in my childhood that I couldn't name. Now I knew why. My father's actions had shaped my life in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. And though the pain was heavy, it was accompanied by the first flicker of empowerment I had felt in years. The knowledge that I now held the truth, and that nothing, not even my father, could take that from me. I took a deep breath. The envelope clutched tightly to my chest. The room felt quieter than before, yet heavier somehow, as if the air itself was waiting for the next step. I had the evidence, I had the confirmation, and I had a decision to make. For the first time, I felt the weight of knowledge balanced by the power to act. And in that quiet, heavy moment, I knew I would confront him with everything I'd learned that I waited in the kitchen. The envelope still in my hands, my father sitting across from me with his head bowed. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of the old floorboards. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve, fingers trembling ever so slightly. For the first time, I sensed fear, not my own, but his, and it was almost palpable, pressing down in the small space between us. He finally looked up, his eyes heavy, rimmed with exhaustion and guilt. "I suppose there's no hiding it anymore," he said quietly, his voice a low rasp that carried years of weight. I didn't respond. I just waited, gripping the envelope like a lifeline, my mind racing through the documents, the letters, the photographs. My chest felt tight, every breath shallow. He shifted, his gaze darting away, then back. "You need to understand, I did what I thought was best." "What you thought was best?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, echoing off the walls. "You kept me from people who loved me. You lied. You manipulated everything I remember." There was a pause, a long, tense silence where the unspoken truths hovered between us like smoke. He flinched, as if my words had struck him physically. Then he nodded, a small, defeated gesture. He began swallowing hard. I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of what could happen if the wrong people got involved. His hands trembled now, resting on the table, twisting a napkin in a nervous rhythm. There were situations, custody issues, people with intentions I didn't trust. I thought I was protecting you, but his voice faltered. He shook his head, unable to finish. I watched him, my stomach twisting in a knot of conflicting emotions. The man I had revered as my protector now seemed vulnerable, small, almost broken. I tried to reconcile the father I loved with the father before me now. Every memory, every holiday, every moment of tension suddenly fit into a new, painful puzzle. He admitted, reluctantly, that letters had been hidden, visits blocked, and truths twisted. The realization slammed into me with a force I hadn't expected. He hadn't been acting out of pure love. Fear, pride, and a desire to control my world had dictated his actions. My foundation of trust, the one I had clung to all my life, began to crumble. He leaned back, exhaling sharply, a tremor in his shoulders. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't want to hurt you, but I see now. I hurt you more by hiding the truth than anything else ever could. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. For a moment, I just stared, trying to comprehend the full weight of his confession. The love I had known was there, yes, but it was entangled with fear and control, a web so tightly woven I had never noticed it until now. I felt a mix of relief and despair. Relief that the truth was finally out, despair at the magnitude of betrayal I had lived under unknowingly. My father's guilt was raw, and yet was only a fraction of the pain I felt. The years of misdirection, the stolen relationships, the life I could have had. I wanted to scream, to throw the envelope across the room, to demand answers for every stolen moment. But instead, I sat quietly, absorbing each confession as it fell. He began to speak of the people I had been kept from, the ones who had fought for me, who had tried to be part of my life. His voice cracked as he recounted missed visits, intercepted letters, and the difficult decisions he had made. Each revelation was a new blow, reshaping every memory I had once trusted. I could feel anger rising, but beneath it was a deeper, heavier sorrow. The truth was devastating, but it was also finally real, tangible, and undeniable. I never wanted to be the villain, he whispered, almost to himself. I thought I was saving you from pain. I didn't realize the pain I was causing by keeping everything hidden. His eyes, wide and pleading, searched mine. I wanted to comfort him, to offer forgiveness, but my own chest was too tight, my heart too raw. I could only nod slowly, acknowledging the truth without absolving the betrayal. The weight of the conversation pressed down on me, leaving a hollow ache that seemed to settle into my bones. Everything I had believed about my childhood, my family, and my father's intentions had shifted in an instant. I understood now that protection and control are dangerously close, that love can be entangled with fear in ways that hurt more than help. And in that quiet kitchen, with him breaking down and me too numb to respond fully, I realized something crucial. The truth had power, even if it arrived too late. I finally exhaled, letting a fraction of the tension leave my body. The room felt unbearably heavy, yet the honesty between us, painful and flawed, was a strange relief. I had the truth. I had the confirmation of what had been hidden, and though the devastation lingered, there was clarity now. My father had told me everything he could bear to admit, and I was left with the knowledge, the grief, and the first taste of agency I had felt in years. I sat alone in my room. The documents from the envelopes spread across my bed, and for the first time in years, I let the memory surface fully. It was a face I had buried, a stranger from my earliest childhood who had appeared in flashes I didn't understand. Sharp eyes, a concerned frown, a sense of urgency that had always unsettled me. I remembered the voice too, faint but commanding, telling me it wasn't safe, that I needed to be careful. Back then, I had dismissed it as a a child's imagination conjured from fear. Now, with the evidence in front of me, it all clicked into place. The memory was real. Every fragment aligned with the letters, court documents, and photographs I had uncovered. I could see the stranger not just as a shadow from my past, but as someone who had genuinely tried to protect me. My father had kept me away, isolated me from the person who might have offered care, guidance, or even love that wasn't entangled in secrecy. The weight of understanding pressed down, heavy and cold, yet it was a clarity I had been craving. I finally knew what my instincts had sensed all along. As I traced the lines of the documents with my fingers, I realized how carefully my early years had been orchestrated. My father had created a story, a world where he alone dictated who I could see, what I could know, and which memories were allowed to survive. And for years, I had trusted it blindly, oblivious to the manipulation. The realization cut deep. I had lived a life filtered through his fear, his need for control, rather than truth. Holidays, birthdays, everyday moments, all tinged with decisions I had never understood. I closed my eyes and let the memory play out again, this time with full awareness. The stranger's warning made perfect sense. The urgency in their eyes, the insistence in their voice. I could almost feel their hand reaching for me, the tension of a situation too complex for a child to grasp. It was terrifying and comforting at the same time. Terrifying because of what could have happened. Comforting because someone had genuinely cared enough to intervene. I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me, mourning the lost years, the conversations I never had, the love I was denied. Then my thoughts turned to my father. I saw him not merely as my protector, but as someone who had chosen control over honesty. I understood why he had acted as he did, but understanding didn't equate to forgiveness. I could see the fear behind his decisions, the pride and the desperate need to feel indispensable. Yet those decisions had cost me connections, trust, and a portion of my own identity. He had been both guardian and jailer, and the truth of that duality hit me harder than any lie could have. I revisited every holiday, every family gathering, every birthday with this new lens. The tension I had once attributed to stress or excitement suddenly made sense as fear. His avoidance of photographs, of phone calls, of seemingly simple traditions. It had all been calculated, a reflection of the dangers he perceived rather than normal parental stress. I felt a strange combination of grief and anger, mourning the innocence lost while marveling at the intricate web that had been spun around me. Each memory I once trusted was now tinged with ambiguity, a mixture of reality and deception. Yet, amid the sorrow, a sense of resolve began to grow. The memory, once suppressed and confusing, had become a catalyst for clarity. I understood who I was in relation to the truth, who my father had been, and who had tried to reach me long before I could even comprehend it. There was power in this clarity, a quiet authority that came from finally seeing the world as it was, unfiltered by someone else's fear. It was painful, but it was also liberating. I lingered on the details of the memory, letting each sensation wash over me. The sharp scent of winter air, the muffled sounds of a distant street, the subtle tension in the room, the feeling of being watched and protected simultaneously. These were the textures of my reality, pieces of a puzzle I had never had the right pieces to complete. Now, they made sense, each one slotting perfectly into the narrative I had only just begun to reconstruct. I realized that truth had a rhythm of its own, and it had finally found me. By the time I put the documents away, I felt a calmness I hadn't known in years. Clarity had replaced confusion. Sorrow had been tempered with understanding, and resolve had taken root in my chest. I knew I needed to reclaim my story, to separate the life I had lived from the one I was meant to live. The memory that had once haunted me was now my compass, guiding me toward honesty, toward connection, and toward the life I deserved. And though the path forward would not be easy, I felt, for the first time in a long time, that I was ready. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, the morning light falling unevenly across the table where the letters and documents lay in front of me. I could feel the tension that had been building for weeks, the anger, the betrayal, the grief. But instead of letting it dictate my actions, I decided to channel it differently. There was no need for confrontation, no need for yelling or dramatic accusations. The most potent form of revenge, I realized, was control over my own story. I would reclaim my life on my terms, and he wouldn't see it coming. The first step was setting boundaries. I began by quietly establishing distance from the family routines that had once bound me. I declined calls at inconvenient times, avoided gatherings that had always been layered with expectation, and stopped participating in the narratives my father tried to maintain. I watched his reactions, subtle at first, then more pronounced. The flinch when I refused to attend yet another holiday dinner. The way his voice softened when he asked why. I let him see only what he needed to, while I retained full control over my emotions and choices. Next, I reached out to the person my father had kept from me, carefully and deliberately. I crafted a message, measured each word, ensuring it conveyed trust, acknowledgement, and the desire to rebuild what had been stolen from us. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't seek apologies. I simply opened the door he had slammed shut for years. When their response arrived, hesitant at first, then gradually warmer, I felt the first true sense of liberation I had experienced in decades. The connection was fragile but real, a thread I could now follow toward rebuilding a part of my past that had been erased. I also took a long, careful look at my father's control. For years, it had been subtle, hidden behind routines, traditions, and the illusion of normalcy. But now I saw it clearly, and I refused to play along. I would no longer protect the version of events he preferred. I would no longer carry his fear as my own. The power shifted quietly but decisively. I wasn't fighting him. I was choosing a life that belonged to me. Every time he tried to assert influence, I met it with calm detachment, withholding the emotional response he had relied on to maintain control. Silence became my tool, and truth became my shield. With each step, I felt a sense of meticulous satisfaction. This wasn't about vengeance in the way movies depict it. There were no schemes to humiliate or punish. It was a slow, deliberate reclamation of autonomy. He had built walls around my past, manipulated the narrative, and isolated me from those who cared. But the walls didn't hold against truth, patience, and resolve. By refusing to react the way he expected, I stripped him of the control he had long taken for granted. The quiet of my decision felt louder than any argument could have. The more I engaged with the person he had blocked from my life, the clearer the contrast became. Their kindness, concern, and integrity highlighted what I had been denied, and I realized how much power had been tied to access to people, memories, and information. By regaining that access, by choosing whom to trust and how to engage with the past, I wasn't just reclaiming what was lost. I was creating a life that couldn't be dictated by his fears. The act of quiet rebellion became empowering, reinforcing the idea that the best form of revenge is the one that elevates yourself, not punishes others. There were moments when I felt the pull of anger, the temptation to confront him with every revelation, every deceit. But I held back, reminding myself that this wasn't about spectacle. It was about the slow, deliberate restoration of my own narrative. Every truth I shared with those he had kept from me, every boundary I maintained, chipped away at the structure he had tried to enforce. And each time, he could only watch, powerless, as the life he tried to control unfolded in ways he could neither predict nor stop. By the end of the month, I had established a rhythm. I visited people he had tried to erase from my history. I reinforced boundaries with family, and I lived in a way that prioritized clarity and honesty. Each decision reinforced my sense of self, my ownership of memory and identity. My father's reactions became increasingly subdued. He realized that the tools he had used for so long, fear, manipulation, secrecy, were no longer effective. He could see the consequences of his choices without me ever raising my voice. The quiet, intelligent revenge was complete. Sitting back in the late afternoon light, I felt a calmness that had eluded me for years. Revenge hadn't come through confrontation or anger, but through reclaiming my story, rebuilding connections, and asserting control over my life. He could no longer dictate my memories, my relationships, or my choices. The power dynamic had shifted, and it had done so without violence, without drama, only through patience, resolve, and unwavering truth. I finally felt free, and for the first time, in full command of the life I was meant to lead. The morning light fell gently through my window, catching the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. I had learned to notice these small details, the quiet, unremarkable pieces of life that once passed me by while I was trapped in confusion and fear. Now, I could observe them without distraction, without the shadow of lies over my head. I had finally reclaimed ownership of my life, and with it, a sense of freedom that felt both strange and exhilarating. I thought back on everything, the betrayal, the secrecy, the years of living with a version of my past that wasn't mine. It had shaped me, yes, but it hadn't broken me. I had the clarity now to understand that family, trust, and identity are fragile, often manipulated by those who fear loss or change. I felt the grief, the sorrow for what was stolen, but I also recognized that grief wasn't a chain. It was a signal, of a reminder of the value of the truth I had fought to reclaim. I could carry it and still move forward. For the first time, I allowed myself to make decisions purely for me. I pursued connections I had been denied, nurtured relationships that felt genuine, and set boundaries where none had existed before. I realized that my happiness, my sense of peace, wasn't dependent on someone else's approval or the version of my past they wanted me to believe. It belonged to me, wholly, and I could shape it with honesty and care. Each choice reinforced my autonomy. Each action reminded me that I was no longer bound by deception. I thought about my father and the weight of his decisions, both protective and controlling. I didn't feel the rush of anger anymore, not the sharp, burning kind that had consumed me for weeks. Instead, there was a quiet understanding. He had acted out of fear as much as love, but fear had twisted his intentions, and control had overtaken care. I could see him clearly now, flawed, human, but powerless over the life I had chosen. The recognition brought neither triumph nor malice, only a deep, steady acceptance of the truth. The holidays arrived, as they always do, and this time I approached them differently. No longer did I feel obligated to conform to traditions that masked tension or fear. I chose how to celebrate, who to include, and what moments mattered. The joy was quieter, more intentional, but also more genuine. I could laugh without hesitation, feel gratitude without restraint, and embrace memories without shadows. For the first time, holidays were mine, fully and honestly mine, and that in itself felt revolutionary. I began documenting my life in small ways, journaling, taking photos, recording conversations that mattered. I wanted to preserve a version of my story that was true, unfiltered by others' fears or manipulations. Each entry, each snapshot, was a declaration of ownership, a safeguard against anyone attempting to rewrite my past again. It was subtle, almost private, but profoundly empowering. Through these actions, I solidified the foundation of a life built on transparency and integrity, not secrecy and control. As weeks turned into months, I noticed a shift within myself. Anxiety that once gripped me in moments of uncertainty had loosened its hold. I felt confident making choices, facing the consequences, and accepting the reality of my past without letting it define my present. I no longer questioned my memories with suspicion, because I had taken the steps to understand them fully. The truth was not only known, it was integrated, a compass guiding me forward instead of a weight holding me back. I also recognized the beauty of selective forgiveness, not to absolve wrongdoing, but to free myself. I forgave the limitations, the lies, the misguided protection, and even the betrayals. Not because they were acceptable, but because carrying them had cost me far more than they ever could. This forgiveness wasn't a gift to anyone else. It was a reclamation of my own peace. I could honor my experiences without being trapped by them, and that distinction was transformative. Standing in the quiet of my living room one evening, I realized that my story was finally mine. Every memory, every relationship, every choice had been examined, reclaimed, or redefined. I had built a life from fragments, from truths uncovered and boundaries established. There was a steady calm in knowing that I would continue to grow, learn, and embrace life on my own terms. The betrayal that had once loomed over me no longer dictated the rhythm of my days. I had discovered that truth, courage, and self-respect are intertwined. They form the foundation for a life that can withstand deception and manipulation. And though the morning after Christmas, the moment it all began, would always be etched into my memory, it no longer held the power to unsettle me. Instead, it served as a reminder of resilience, of clarity, and of the life I had chosen. In reclaiming my story, I had reclaimed myself, and that quiet, steady sense of freedom was more profound than any holiday joy, any reunion, or any apology could ever provide.